I'm currently in the process of creating yet another Bakerloo blouse for myself, but this time an Ankara African wax fabric blouse for myself. And I've got all the pieces for the main blouse cut out. When I got to the part of the ruffled collar, I thought, why don't I switch on my camera to show you how I go through creating the ruffled collar that would go with this blouse. If you want to know how to add a ruffled collar to a blouse of your choice, or the Bakerloo blouse, of course, then keep on watching this video. If you're new to the channel, do not forget to subscribe, because here on the channel we work together to demystify the making of clothes. My name is Juliet Uzor of sewsonatural.com, and you're most definitely welcome to my sewing space. This here is going to be where I'll cut out my collar from. This is the collar piece, collar pattern piece. That's going to be the back, and that's going to be the front of the pattern. I want my front of the pattern to keep in line with the direction of the pattern piece, because this is a one direction pattern. So the print goes in this direction. It's like scales. So I want to make sure that the front goes, like the front direction matches the direction on the actual blouse. This is my blouse pattern piece that's already cut out. If I cut it out with the front going that way, then it would defeat the purpose of trying to match it. So I'm going to turn this around this way and cut it out in this direction. So if I cut it out in this direction, this collar will sit beautifully on top of this blouse piece. This is the blouse and that's the neckline, and they would match. Only problem here is that the back pattern would then go diagonally, but I don't really mind that much about it. But if you are very bothered about that, my tip would be to go along this is the shoulder notch. I would draw a line down and then I would cut. When you cut along this line, oh, it's supposed to be a scissors. You cut here, and when you cut here, you would add half inch there, or 1 centimeter, whatever seam allowance you're happy with, and then you would add half an inch along this side. So you cut it, add seam allowance, add seam allowance. That would then allow you to position this piece wherever you want it to go, and position this piece wherever you want it to go. But don't forget to maintain the grain lines of your pattern pieces when you're doing that. I'm going to position the front so my front pieces are in the right direction. So I'm going to cut out another pair because you need to face it. The lining, which is the facing or lining, whichever way you call it, it doesn't matter what direction the print faces, because that's the one that goes on the inside. So I'm just going to cut them out. And the thing is, I've got limited fabric to work with anyway, but keeping in mind the grain line as well. Next thing I'll do is to cut out some interfacing for the collar. At this point, I have sewn together the front bodice and the back bodice. I have also finished the raw edges using my overlocker, and now I am giving them a press. Also, I stay stitched the neckline of the blouse just to make sure that it does not stretch out of shape. On one side of the collar, I pressed on some lightweight interfacing. And now this long strip here, which is a collar frill, would be folded into half, and one edge of it will be sewn together. After being sewn together, turn it inside out. So 2 rows of stitches that will be gathered together to create these lovely gathers or frills that will be attached to the edge of the collar. It takes a bit of easing, stretching out and reshaping just to make sure that the gathered frills fit all around the edge of the collar. But you have to just take your time with it, and do note that it doesn't have to get to the very edge of the collar piece. So you need to leave about a 1.5 centimeter gap to allow for stitching and finishing of the neckline. Going to sandwich the frills in between the two collar pieces. One of them is interfaced and the other one is not interfaced. Join the two pieces at the notches and pin all around. It's time to trim off the bulk of fabric at the seam allowances, but when you cut off the corner you have to be extremely careful just to avoid cutting through the stitches that you've just made. So trim that triangle off the corner and then trim the seam allowance. I like to trim both sides of the seam allowance. Some people prefer to grade, as in cut one side of the seam allowances and leave the other ones, but I just like to cut them all as much as possible, trim them all the way down and reduce all amounts of bulk that I can. Give the collars a good press. At this point, what I'm doing here is I am joining the collar onto the bodice, but making sure that the notches on the collar matches the shoulder seam of the bodice. Afterwards, I can now pin some bias binding onto the neckline. This bias binding only has one side of it folded over. The other side isn't folded or pressed down. I'm just going to pin it all around and sew along the seam allowance. I think I used about a 1/2 inch seam allowance for this one here. At the very edge, I trimmed off the excess and folded the fabric or the bias binding over just to give it a clean edge, and sew all the way round. As you can see now, I have my bias binding sewn onto the neckline. I now need to clip that seam allowance just to make sure that when I turn the bias binding around to the wrong side, it will lay nice and smooth without any puckers. I also have to trim off the excess at the end, because you know I did some folding at the back, center back of the blouse, so it's just a lot of fabric there, and I think it's best to trim it off before folding over and sewing in the bias binding onto the neckline of the blouse. You can either pin the bias binding onto the neckline from the wrong side or from the right side. Some people like to sew from the wrong side and some people prefer to sew from the right side. I'll show you both. That's option 1. Other people prefer to pin and sew from the wrong side, and I'm showing you how you could do that there. Go along and sew the bias binding onto the neckline just to make sure that the raw edges are hidden on the inside. And you can see how nice and flat it is now. The reason why it's flat like that is because I clipped and, cut into the seam allowance after sewing on the bias binding. At this point, I decided to select a white beautiful button for my blouse, and I made a thread loop buttonhole for it. I have a video which details how to create one of these easy button holes using just threads. I'll link it in the description box below, and I'll leave a card up there for you. And at the very end, all you do is give the neckline a beautiful steam press just to make sure everything lays nice and flat. I found these collars very trendy and very easy to make, and I'll leave here on the screen more easy projects that I have made here on the channel, and I hope to see you over at those videos. Enjoy the rest of your day and all the very best. Take care. Bye.